Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Bishop, and welcome to the International Silicone Conference organized by Rubber and Plastics News. We are certain that you'll enjoy a variety of speakers and panel discussions offered throughout the conference. Our next speaker is Alexandra Rhinehart. Alex is the Environmental and Regulatory Supervisor at Shin-Etsu Silicones of America, supporting the Americas. She serves as the current chair of the Regulatory and Public Affairs Committee as part of SEHSC domestically, and is also a member of the Global Silicones Council, supporting international advocacy. Let me now turn the discussion over to Alexandra.
Thank you, Eric. And hello, good morning. My name is Alexandra Rhinehart, and I am currently the chair of the Regulatory and Public Affairs Committee of SEHSC. And today I will be providing you with a high-level overview of our current silicone industry policy advocacy and international product stewardship. This presentation will comprise of the following topics: a brief overview of SEHSC, our global advocacy goals, and a silicone regulatory overview by region, highlighting the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, China, India, Korea, and Europe. The Silicone Environmental Health and Safety Center, or SEHSC, is an American Chemistry Council sector group comprised of the following North American silicone producers and importers: Dow, Elchem, Evonik, Milliken, Momentive, Shin-Etsu, and Wacker. Our mission statement is to support the safe use of silicones through product stewardship and environmental health and safety research. Our global advocacy goals are to proactively encourage the development of risk-based weight of evidence regulatory safety evaluations for silicone materials. We are also discouraging scientifically unjustified listings of D4, otherwise known as octamethyl-cyclotetrasiloxane, a critical building block for polymers, as a persistent organic pollutant, or POP, under the Stockholm Convention. The Global Silicones Council, our sector group that is international, is focused on preventing D4 being listed as a POP through continued advocacy to EU member states and priority countries to oppose the EU Commission's proposal to nominate D4. We also advocate that countries conduct their own assessment of D4 and other siloxane materials using a risk-based weight of evidence approach. This means to avoid adopting assessment conclusions or risk management approaches from countries or regions that do not utilize this risk-based weight of evidence approach. For the United States, we advocate for requiring the use of risk-based determinations for state chemical assessments. States should recognize the US EPA as the primary authoritative regulatory entity for chemical assessment determinations. The Global Silicones Council has designated the following as top priority countries and regions, which we will discuss today. Beginning in 2014, SEHSC, in collaboration with the EPA, conducted a D4 environmental monitoring program to characterize sources and pathways of releases to the environment. This program monitored the wastewater treatment facilities throughout the US for the presence of D4 in influent and effluent, and this was completed in 2017. This data was used in a 2018 peer-reviewed third-party environmental risk evaluation, which concluded that there is negligible risk from D4 to organisms based on environmentally realistic exposure concentrations. After completion of our monitoring program, SEHSC submitted a manufacturer-requested risk evaluation for D4 in 2020. We are pleased to announce that as of October of 2020, the EPA has agreed to conduct a risk evaluation of D4. To date, the EPA has not imposed any regulatory restrictions on the manufacture, process, or use of D4. As part of our advocacy and science goals, we encourage the EPA to promote their TSCA approach to chemicals management globally, and look forward to a positive and scientifically sound risk assessment of D4 from the EPA. Following siloxane regulatory assessments in Canada and Australia, Canada and Australia both have not imposed any use restrictions or concentration-based restrictions on D4, D5, or D6. We encourage the Canadian and Australian governments to support and defend their siloxane assessments internationally, supporting a risk-based weight of evidence approach. We also encourage Canada and Australia to promote their approaches to chemicals management internationally. In China, our goal is to link silicone chemistry to the domestic policy priorities in China, focusing on renewable energies, energy efficiency, and sustainability goals. Partnering with the Global Silicones Council, China is completing its D4 risk assessment, which should be finalized by 2022. We encourage China to pursue risk assessment for most compounds in China. In India and Korea, again, our goal is to link silicone chemistry to domestic policy priorities in both regions. We encourage India and Korea to consider exposure in their assessments of SI substances. Both countries are new to implementing chemical risk management, so we encourage India and Korea to do risk assessments for all their substances. In 2022, India drafted their chemical safety rule, which provides for a risk-based weight of evidence approach to chemicals management. This rule is expected to be made final in Q1 of 2021. For both countries, the Global Silicones Council has had in-person workshops with industry, value chain, and regulators to collaborate and share best practices. In Japan, to date, Japan has not imposed any regulatory restrictions on the manufacture, process, or use of D4, D5, or D6. Ongoing evaluations of D4 and D6 continue within the Ministry of the Environment. We will keep advocating for the use of risk-based chemical assessment using a weight of evidence approach. The EU has proposed several restrictions on siloxane materials. The first of these is the wash-off restriction. In April of 2015, the United Kingdom proposed to ECHA to limit contents of D4 and D5 in wash-off personal care products under normal conditions of use. By January of 2018, this restriction was published in the Official Journal of the European Union. This means that all manufacturers that place on the market products that are within the restriction scope were required to comply with the requirements set forth in this restriction by January of this year. Industry did secure important exempted materials from this restriction, including sealants and dental implants. In April of the same year, legal action was filed by industry against the ECHA decision to restrict D4 and D5 in wash-off personal care products. This case is still pending before the General Court, and our most recent update was an oral hearing that was performed in September of this year. In June of 2018, the ECHA Member State Committee decided to add D4, D5, and D6 to the candidate list for authorization as substances of very high concern, or SVHCs. An SVHC listing is the first step in the procedure for authorization or restriction of use of a chemical. An SVHC listing requires suppliers of mixtures of substances containing more than 0.1% by weight of any SVHC to notify their customers of the SVHC in their product, and also notify ECHA if the article they produce contains SVHCs in quantities above 1 ton per producer or importer per year, and if the substance is present in those articles above the 0.1% weight by weight concentration. In September of the same year, legal action was filed by industry, seeking the annulment of the ECHA decision to list D4 through D6 as SVHCs. This case is also still pending before the General Court, and there was an oral hearing in September of this year. In 2018, the EU proposed additional restrictions of D4, D5, and D6 in leave-on personal care products and other consumer and professional uses in concentrations equal to or greater than 0.1% weight by weight of each substance. This includes, but it is not limited to, dry cleaning, waxes and polishes, and other cleaning products. The EU additionally requested ECHA to include the use of D6 in their wash-off cosmetic products in the restriction proposal. In 2020, ECHA's Expert Committee for Risk and Socioeconomic Assessment, the RAC and CEAC, supported this proposal for D4, D5, and D6 in final formulated products for consumer and professional use sold in the EU. Once the proposal is drafted, it will go through consultation before being notified by the World Trade Organization for a 60-day consultation period, which allows for public commenting. This proposal has a 5-year transition period for leave-on personal care products. In March of 2020, ECHA started a public consultation on the draft recommendation to prioritize D4, D5, and D6 for authorization. The authorization process in the EU aims to ensure that substances of very high concern, or SVHCs, are progressively replaced by less dangerous substances or technologies where technically and economically feasible alternatives are available. The global silicone industry submitted extensive comments during this consultation, and the Global Silicones Council strongly advocates against authorization for D4, D5, and D6. In February of 2021, the ECHA Member State Committee is expected to prepare its opinion on the draft recommendation, taking into account the received comments. By April of May of 2021, the ECHA Member State Committee is expected to finalize this recommendation and submit it to the European Commission. A potential POP nomination. The Stockholm Convention on POPs, or persistent organic pollutants, is an international environmental treaty that aims to eliminate or restrict the production and use of a POP. Substances listed as a POP are prohibited from production or use as manufacturing intermediates or ingredients in other products in commerce unless certain exemptions apply. In November of 2019, the EU Member State POP Competent Authority reviewed the EU Commission's priority substances for 2020 Stockholm Convention POP nominations. D4 was mentioned, but member states did not support D4 as a priority for 2020. In June of 2020, the EU Member State POP Competent Authority reviewed priority substances for 2021. D4 remains on this list, but interventions by member states indicate that this is not a priority at this time. The Global Silicones Council is committed to the fact that D4 fails to meet POP criteria. It does not undergo long-range transport in water. It is not readily degraded in the air, as confirmed by regulatory evaluations in Canada and the EU. Because of its unique combination of physical and chemical properties, it does not biomagnify in the food web. Lastly, it does not present a risk to human health or the environment. The impact of D4 being a POP is significant and devastating to our industry. This would result in a global ban of D4 from commerce, which would have wide, disproportionate, and unjustified implications that go beyond the direct use of D4 in the applications of concern as identified by REACH. This would, of course, negatively impact the use of silicone polymers, for which D4 is an essential building block. None of the innovative applications from silicone polymers, from renewable energy technologies to transportation safety would be possible. Switching back to the US, in this infographic, you will see that the red represents silicone materials that are in state chemical concern lists, and the green indicates continued monitoring to assess the impact for silicones. The top state activities of concern are as follows. In Washington, D4 was originally listed on their chemical of concerns for alleged endocrine factors, but we successfully advocated against this listing and delisted it due to weight of evidence approach. In Oregon and Vermont, D4 is currently listed on their chemical of concern list as being a PBT. A PBT is persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, which we do not agree with. It is on this list because they applied EU PBT criteria with no consideration for exposure. In Maine, D4 and D5 are both listed on their chemicals of concern. This is also due to PBT criteria with no consideration for exposure. D6 was originally listed as well, but it is now delisted because there is no ruling by an authoritative body. In Minnesota, D5 and D6 are also listed on their chemicals of concern as a PBT. This is on the list because of inclusions on a hazard-based list. The challenges for identifying chemicals of concern in the U.S. are that many states don't actually have the resources to conduct scientific evaluations. Therefore, the states rely on evaluations conducted by an authoritative government entity. It's a very broad description. The basis for authoritative government entities are not consistent, state by state. Some government entities use risk-based determinations. Others use hazard-based determinations to classify. In SCHSC's advocacy for the identification of chemicals of concern, the chemical of concern list should rely on authoritative regulatory determinations and should express a preference for determinations that are informed by risk-based evaluations. Regulatory determinations made in the U.S. under the reformed TSCA statute should be used preferentially by the U.S. states' chemical of concerns listings. Overall, silicone policy advocacy boils down to three main points. 1. Current modeling programs are not indicative of the fate and exposure of silicone chemistry. Therefore, empirical monitoring data is critical for our compounds. 2. Single criteria should not be relied upon exclusively for hazard determination. And 3. Data and modeling information should be used collectively in a weight of evidence assessment of risk. Overall, it's important for all regulators to know that siloxanes, particularly D4, D5, and D6, which we discussed today, are safe. There is a wealth of science that confirms that siloxanes do not behave like PBTs in the environment. Second, no regulatory restrictions are warranted. Lastly, siloxanes provide countless invaluable and unique benefits, primarily as indispensable building blocks to produce silicone to consumers and innovative solutions to society at large. For additional resources on the silicone industry, specific to U.S. regulations, you may go to www.sehsc.americanchemistry.com. For our global initiatives, please visit globalsilicones.org, and all additional country-specific resources fill the remainder of this list. And now I am welcome to questions.
Thanks a lot, Alexandra. I appreciate your presentation. I do have a few questions for you. First, how will the EPA accepted MRRE outcome affect regulatory determinations in the EU?
Well, that is a good question. A favorable EPA risk assessment would be significant for the silicone industry. The U.S. is a powerhouse for innovation and regulatory determinations, and we could leverage a positive outcome against the strict and unjust EU determinations that we see today. It will also inform our states' regulatory risk determinations, such as those chemical of concerns listings that I spoke of earlier.
Excellent, thank you. I have another question for you. Why do some regulatory agencies consider D4, D5, and D6 as PBT and VPVB respectively, but the industry believes that no further regulation is needed?
Existing modeling is not indicative of silicon chemistry sets. Real-world data shows that D4 through D6 do not behave as PBT or VPVBs in the environment. They don't build up in the food chain. Existing EU criteria were developed based on carbon-based substances, which are not appropriate for cell oxide. And the majority of D4 and D5 and D6 will evaporate quickly into the atmosphere. Once in the atmosphere, they break down within days due to natural and physical processes.
Excellent, excellent. My last question for you is, would there be any socio-economic impacts of a regulatory decision on D4, D5, or D6?
Oh, yes. The authorization process in the EU, it focuses on restricting our substances. That's obviously going to provide negative connotations, but also if a POP designation is made for D4, this eliminates D4 entirely from our process, even as an intermediate. And so this would be pretty devastating for our economy and our industry.
I would certainly agree with that. Alex, I really want to thank you, and I would also like to thank our audience for attending this session of the International Silicon Conference, and thank you to our sponsors for supporting this conference as well. If you want to revisit this session or any others from the conference, they will be available on Rubber and Plastics News website, which is rubbernews.com, after the event is completed. And please don't forget that you can connect with your colleagues here through the virtual networking program, which can be found on the left-hand side of your screen. Simply click the Meet icon to start connecting with fellow attendees. I thank you for joining us today. Take care.